Welcome back, my advanced level subscribers. This really is where I start to have a lot of fun with the painting and start working some of those details, bringing in some of the details. The painting is still a little bit tacky, so I'm not getting absolute opaque whites, but it's much easier. I'm not lifting up too much of that tonal ground. So I'm able to get my highlights on there a lot more consistently than I did the previous day. Using the edge of that filbert rosemary brush. It's a size 2 ultimate filbert long handle. It's really nice for keeping some of those expressive brush marks, especially when the bristles, help you mold your subject matter. Now that I'm getting a little bit thicker, this area's a little drier, I'm able to use some of those ivory brushes as well, those flat ivory brushes. What you see me doing here, I'm using a rag and a fan brush just to oil out the canvas. It was looking, where it dried, it got quite matte and I couldn't really determine how it would look when finished and when it has its layer of varnish on there. It was looking matte in areas and shiny in other areas, so I added a very fine layer of the CCS medium over the top just to make the surface malleable and the paint nice and smooth when I apply it, and to make the finish consistent all across so I could see what I was working with. You can tell now that it's dry how much easier it is to put the opaque paint on over the top, and not a lot of that orange is bleeding into those lighter areas there in the foreground. In fact, you can see the opposite. You could see how much difficulty I had the day before to get those areas white or bluish white without the ground bleeding through. I mean, I still like little parts of the ground bleeding through, but not as much as it was. So now that it's tacky and dry, it's so much easier to work with. This is a little bit of an extension of my blocking in. I'm just correcting those colours that I wasn't able to get on the first pass when I was working with the underpainting. And I'm starting to bring out some of those details, some of the colours and tones in the shadow of those little ripples in the water. Lots of greys and purples and blues. These marks help distinguish the plane of the water as well, so I'm making sure to be pretty consistent with my angles here. One of the things which I found a little bit odd when I was working with my reference image, changing some of the shapes and moving things around, adding elements to the sky. One of the things that I found odd is the composition didn't work quite as well when the horizon was perfectly parallel with the top and bottom of the canvas. And I don't know exactly why it didn't work. So with this canvas, deliberately, the horizon is at a slight angle. And that first wave is also obviously at a certain, at a set angle that is closer to being parallel to the canvas. Normally I'd like to keep my horizon as flat as I possibly could, but it didn't work. It looked odd. And I think it was about balancing the mass of the land on the right hand side and those angles of the clouds. It's peculiar, but I couldn't get it to... I tried, but I couldn't get it to work when it was parallel, so there's an angle to my horizon. It's much easier for me to get those thick waves and the white water on that wave that was breaking out there just offshore, now that the underpainting is touch dry. I'm setting my highest value so that I'll have a better idea of the tonal adjustments of my sky, and especially the mass of the land on the right hand side. I've switched brushes. I'm using a very cheap short handle brush which had a nice sharp edge because it was new. Quite often when I use my brushes for many months, I lose that sharp edge. So I've taken to almost getting disposable brushes, which I can just use on a couple of occasions, and they keep that really sharp, clean, crisp edge. They don't last too long, but I'm happy to throw them away because, I get them from like liquidators, and I use them for a very specific purpose, and then once they start to feather at the points, then I don't feel so bad about handing them down. A much softer bristle, almost like a hybrid synthetic oil and acrylic bristle brush, just to, get those fine details. Working on the transitions there, trying not to lift too much of the blues. Really working at arm's length to keep a good feel and movement to the water. Now that I've worked in some of the details there in the white water, it's time for me to turn my attention back to the sky, and you can see as I'm starting to put on some of that blue, it's covering up the muddiness of the underpainting and making it really nice and clean and saturated. Nice light clean blues rather than having all of that orange coming through. Oops, made a couple of little mistakes there on the horizon. It's nice when you can put the paint on opaque and it stays opaque and it covers up everything underneath. I have to bring up the highlights of those clouds. I don't want the clouds to be too imposing though, and I also need to change some of the colours, the hue in the darker part of the blue. I felt like it was too cerulean. It needed to be a little bit more ultramarine, a little bit more purple. So right now, just fine-tuning, softening out some of those edges of the clouds, bringing in some purples into the shadow. If this is a plein air piece, I would have been happy just leaving the clouds as they were, with all that orange popping through, you know, much more expressive. But since this is a studio painting and I had a particular vision in mind, I'm softening the clouds. This is where I adjust, I think, the blue tones in the darker area of the sky by mixing some ultramarine with some white, taking that greenish cool edge off and bringing a little bit of warmth into the blue. You can see the tone changing. It's a little bit more purple. A lot more purple up there on the top left hand side. Much more natural transition through the colours in the sky. Lower down at the horizon you always have that kind of cerulean, almost lightened phthalo blue, and then as it gets higher up into the atmosphere, turns more of a sort of purplish ultramarine blue. I can already feel it looks more of a natural sky rather than that more expressive initial. And it set it back. When I first did it, the sky felt like it was coming too far forward in the image, just because it was a little bit too vibrant and there was so much of it, and the warm tones were actually making it feel like it was closer. I feel now that the painting, you know, the sky has found its right place within the work and sits at the back behind the hills there, meets with the horizon in a more natural way. It's time to fine-tune some of those rocks, bring out some of the details. I was a little bit worried when I was going into this rocky area that I was going to lose some of these shapes. I really wanted to bring some orange, some warmth into the shadows of those rocks, but I also wanted to keep their form nice and consistent. So add in some greens, add in little bits of blue, giving a nice variety to the different types of stone that's washed up in the pebbles. Some of them were like highlights were really strong. Others had a almost mossy green. These little sharp highlights where the rocks are wet and reflecting. I love how that brings the foreground alive. So as I mentioned, I felt like I'd lost some of the shapes there a little bit, so I'm bringing back some of those shaded areas just to keep that rock formation a nice feature. And I'm keeping the most difficult part to last for some reason. I mean, definitely right now, as it stands, the hillside has almost no dimension, even though there's a variety of different tones in there. I have certainly not nailed a natural feel. There's no atmospheric perspective really in that hillside on the right hand side, so I'm just leaving that until after the rest of the painting has come together, so because I know it's going to require a lot of thought and attention. The reference image didn't show any real atmospheric perspective, so I had to be very conscientious about the warm and cool tones in the shadows, and also the saturation in the greens as it moved towards the foreground. I wanted to make sure that my shadows of my foliage also got gradually darker as they came closer. So I'm working with the furthest away objects there, that little tree on the landmass that's protruding out into the ocean. And for the most part, I'm doing more desaturating and saturating than I am painting in colour. So I'm using a lot of greys in the areas that are further away, and then I'm adding more yellow and orange to the trees that are closer, and I exaggerate it as I get closer to that bush on the right hand side. You can see I'm exaggerating some of the greens and making them a lot more saturated, making that dark area under the tree real dark compared to the shadows in the distance. And reworking, modifying, tuning those shadows, adding little bits of blue and purple to those shadows to set them back a little bit, and really saturating the greens as I come closer. Now you can immediately see, just using different tones, actually sorry, that's incorrect, different saturated values as you come closer to the viewer. There it is, lots of yellow in the foreground, and more of a minty green highlight as you get further away. I'm still not entirely happy with it, so I'm going to go away from it for a little bit and then come back. Adding some greys. I've found recently that adding grey and blue to my foliage really helps transitions between light and dark. Quite often it isn't just, light on the edge and then a dark green area, it transitions through saturation as well. So adding grey, using grey as a tool to soften areas, soften transitions between highlights and lowlights or shadows in foliage. So right now I'm walking away from the piece and I'm coming back and I'm sitting and I'm making conscious decisions to adjust areas. But it's starting to feel pretty nice. So I feel like I'm coming into the home stretch right now. This is the period of the painting which takes the most time and the least amount of painting. I usually sit back for 5-10 minutes and resist the urge to come into the painting, make the adjustments in my mind, and then come and work on the painting and go back and sit. So it takes a lot of just sitting, assessing, and then just little touches of paint here and there. long periods of just letting my eye wander around the painting to figure out what feels like it works or could be better. You know, I even get to the stage where I sign it, as I'm doing here. And then I take some photos, and then the next day I come down and work on it more. So it's not over until it's over. I mean, on this particular occasion, the customer wanted me to put the name of the place on the painting, and it didn't work. So I took it off. It's the beauty of working in oil. But the painting, I think, was finished at this point, and I'm happy with the outcome. I'm going to be doing another one, similar size. I probably won't make it into a tutorial, but I am going to take away a lot of things that I learned in the process of this. Sometimes, you know, throwing myself into new methods and techniques which could potentially save me time and work better, or like on this occasion, I just proved that what I was doing before was the best. You know, you've always got to take a couple of risks in order to grow. So my experiments today at the beginning didn't really pay off, but I'm much clearer and I've learned a lot from the process. Thank you again so much, as always, for your continued support. I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to share my processes, open my doors of my studio to you, to come in and have an in-depth experience of how I build my paintings. And until next time, I look forward to hearing your comments, but thank you ever so much. And if you want to share this with your friends and family and anybody else you think would benefit from my experience, please do. All right, take care.